Welcome to A Witch in Ivalice, a Final Fantasy XII podcast. I am E.T., an FF12 fan and prequel novels writer. And today's topic is Religion and Ivalice, Occuria versus Light of Kiltia. Now before we start, let me bring up one small clarification. Although I do refer to myself as a prequel novels writer, because frankly that's what I am, any information given in this podcast comes from official sources or canon ones, which do not even include the FF12 manga, nor do they include the other games inside the Ivalice Alliance, such as Final Fantasy Tactics, Vagrant Story, and so on. Even Final Fantasy XII Revenant Wings is out of scope. Therefore, only plain FF12 branded material, such as official books and interviews, will be taken into account, with the best source being the game itself. While today's topic, Religion and Ivalice, is mentioned in other sources, this will solely focus on FF12. So let's start with religion. Now that's a touchy topic, even in Ivalice, and even if the plot is less religious than it is political. But how much religion here influences politics? Let's see that. This episode's title mentions two entities, the Light of Kiltia, which has the gods of worship, and the Occuria, who are introduced to us as the gods of creation. I will first make a parallel between the two entities before diving into each group separately. The Light of Kiltia is a religion that people follow with gods that they worship, and we can say that it favors freedom and fraternity, whereas the Occuria, the gods of creation, value constraint over humans and everyone on Ivalice, as well as control. The Light of Kiltia has followers, believers, who talk about it and make the religion alive, especially the Humes and Numo, as well as other races who are present in Mount Baramases and practice this religion daily. It is visible. However, the Occuria, no one talks about them actually. When the party goes to Ajora village to meet with the Garif chief, when Ash asks about the Nephesite and the Occuria, it's like she talked about Voldemort, seriously. The Garif chief reacts in a very specific way, maybe because of what happened with his people in the past. And the Occuria are present only in written legend. Paradoxically, no one ever saw a wild pharum roaming around Ivalice, nor any of the polytheistic gods from the Light of Kiltia. However, the Occuria can be seen by their chosen ones, such as Princess Ash or King Grateful. Therefore, we can state as introduction that the Light of Kiltia's god's presence is not visible, while their benefit is. And the other way around, for the Occuria. Their presence can be visible, while their benefit, from what the game shows, might not be. Now let's start with the first part, the Light of Kiltia. Its history started 2,000 years before the game. It is an established religion which began in the continent of Ardalia. Now if you remember the last episode, Ardalia is the continent of Prazaria and Dalmasca. There was a prophet who was named Kiltia, and his goal was to teach the right word to everyone. And when I say everyone, I mean really everyone. To the point that the countries that were in place at the time got tired of that, and all of Kiltia's community was persecuted. It is interesting to stop here at the fact that the Light of Kiltia religion began in the Ardalian continent, because in there we have the kingdom of Dalmasca, and most of the Kiltia cult that we see in the game, which is not in Baramases, takes place in Dalmasca, with all the celebrations. Also, Once again, it is really a shame that we are not able to check if Rosarian people are more religious than Arcadian ones, for example, given this history. Now, if we were to make a parallel with the first episode and say, hey, what do we know about the topic? If there was one word, what would it be? Ferrum, of course, the god Ferrum. And if the question is Kiltia's cult the original one that we just talked about the god Ferrum alone? The answer is no. The light of Kiltia, as a religion, started with the good old duality between good and evil, just like Cosmos and Chaos from the Final Fantasy Dissidia fighting games, if you played those. And between those, it is interesting that it's not like one or the other, it's between those, between light and darkness. There lies Ferrum. So Ferrum is the god that symbolizes balance, which is basically what we need in daily life. As real people, as fantasy people, it is a concept that always works and somehow speaks better than light or something that is always positive. And that concept, along with Kiltia's teachings, garnered a lot of followers. However, the two opposite deities plus Ferrum were not all in the light of Kiltia's gods, because in the end, it was like an Olympus with several other gods, which we don't know about. Except Miriam. Yes, Miriam, from the Still Shrine of Miriam. Miriam is the god of war, sort of Mars from the Roman mythology. But Miriam is also the ancient deity of swords, and that is why, when King Wraithful entrusted the Sword of Kings to the Grand Kiltias of his time, the latter chose the Still Shrine of Miriam as a hideout for it. The Tomb of Wraithful, for example, is different because it has no religious background behind. While here we have a god of swords watching over a sword. Brilliant, right? Thus, it is a polytheistic religion. And this aspect was essential for Prophet Kiltia. However, after some years, we're not sure if it's a few years or a few centuries, came another religious leader by the name of Ajora. And that person thought that the light of Kiltia should only be worshipping Ferrum. She created a sect inside the light of Kiltia, and this sect actually became the main one. And that is why in the game, we basically only see people worshipping Ferrum, and no one talks about the other gods anymore. And it was so successful that this person got sanctified as Saint Ajora. And I think you can see the pattern starting here, with society used to have polytheistic religions or pagan cultures being replaced by monotheistic religion, such as Christianity or Islam, in our continents like Europe, Africa, or America. About the god Ferrum, we can say that during one of the ceremonies in Dalmasca, either Ferrum or another god from the light of Kiltia, or both, is being called the Great Father and the Mother of all, which is typical to a god to whom we owe our life, our death, and everything in between. So that's worship, and I think everyone who played the game after Baromeses noticed that any religious person ends their sentences with Ferrum. And of course, Ferrum is the equivalent of Amen. I mean, depending on the monotheistic actual religion we choose. And they always have a prayer to say. Like, we just want to visit the Still Shrine of Miriam and see what's inside, and they're like, Ferrum, Ferrum, Ferrum. To the extent it's like the Mughals' Kupo. So that's something typical to people who want to wish something positive for the persons they meet. And as I said in the beginning, we can say that Kiltia's attitude 2000 years before the game was plain proselytism, aggressive proselytism according to the ruling countries of this era. Therefore, Kiltia followers back then and until the game's time had to adapt, because talking about converting people was not accepted any longer. Therefore, they're doing some kind of work that can be found in current books about individual development, like spiritual development, and that was more accepted in Ivalice. And now, the light of Kiltia, if we're not counting actual believers who go to Baromeses for pilgrimage, etc., is mainly a trend, a cultural trend among the wealthy people. or some ruling class, such as the Galatian royal families of Dalmatia and Nabrodia. Because we see in the game, actually the game begins with the wedding of Princess Ash and Prince Wrestler, which is under a Kiltia ceremony, and then Prince Wrestler goes to war, and then Prince Wrestler is dead. So they follow Kiltia ceremonies for marriage, funerals, and war declarations. At least that's the official story. Apart from that, the Kiltia followers, the true ones who practice daily, promote a modest life with simple clothing, and that sounds like, for example, Christian teachings of being humble and living like the poor. This is something in common, but there are more similarities, as we will see. Now with the ranks. Every church has ranks. Kiltia, the prophet, used to convert people by saying that everyone is the same under Farum. But just like the actual church or most religions, it's not exactly perfect equality. Of course, we have the highest rank, which is the Grand Kiltias, who is currently of Helga race. It is a race that can live several centuries, don't know exactly how many, and this one at least can talk through telepathy. And under the Grand Kiltias, we don't know exactly if there are ranks in between, but we have the rank of Celebrant. And under Celebrant, we have hymns and acolytes. Not sure who is above whom. The thing we do know is that acolytes are mostly pneumo. If you go ask around Mount Amicis, you will find that the pneumos there have the rank of acolyte. And hymns, the hymns we see is a hymn. Both an acolyte and a hymns were involved in game hunts. They were the petitioners. As for the celebrant, we don't have an example, but we know that starting from rank celebrant and higher, I mean, maybe there is something between celebrant and Grand Kiltias, these people do not have the right to be involved in any politics whatsoever. We will see that it's not that easy, but officially, these people do not have any right to be involved in any country's business. Maybe the lower ranks are allowed to, because, for example, they belong to a country and they still have commitments to this country. But if you're a celebrant or a higher rank within the Kiltia church, then you should absolutely not officially be involved with any country in Ivalice, which becomes harder and harder as danger draws near during the game. But if you've played the game, I can already hear your remarks, like, hey, isn't the Grand Kiltias able to recognize the successors of the thrones of the Brodian and Dalmascan kingdoms already called politics? And it's a role Kiltia always had. What's more, isn't the fact that some members of Kiltia go to hunt monsters in the Paramena Rift kinda called having an army? Because of course, their role is to protect Mount Amicis, but they still have weapons and they fight against monsters and maybe something else than monsters along the way. Closer to the game, isn't the fact that Anastasis says that both Larsa and Alcid do not dream of war called diplomacy? Especially knowing that Anastasis can kinda read into the future. So these diplomatic skills, political skills, and also the fact that he has an army makes me want to compare the fictional figure of the Grand Kiltias with the actual, at least in the past, medieval times figure of the Catholic Pope. The Pope had an army. The Pope even had a state, territories in Italy and outside Italy, during more than 1,000 years. And of course, the Pope had diplomatical power. If one king in Europe wanted something, then they couldn't do it at all if the Pope disagreed with it. What about empires all around Europe? Empires and kings, for example, the French king, formerly the English king, and the Holy Roman emperors, all sought to be crowned by the Pope, because coronation by the Pope gave them legitimacy to rule in times that were kinda always troubled, to say the least. Let us pursue this parallel by talking about the hunt Fafnir in the game. Fafnir is the huge dragon that is a threat in Paramena Rift in the later part of the game. In order to vanquish Fafnir, there is one of the warrior Kiltias that went there to fight the beast. and he didn't make it out alive. And that made one of the persons who were witnessing what's going on in Mount Boromyces, and who is of Ajora, called Reli, I guess, think a lot about what it means to be part of a community and the values that are brought up by religion. All mainstream religions in our world, such as fraternity and helping the poor, helping the ones who lost everything in wars and who are refugees in Boromyces. If you remember, she was initially very stern, very despising of humans in general and humans who want to help each other in particular. She had a very grim approach of life. And that fact, that loss, made her think everything anew and have a different outlook on everything. And she went from being the #1 Kiltia critic to the #1 Kiltia helper. And that is, objectively, thanks to religion. So that is the kind of stories that could be told today to manifest, to emphasize the positive role that religion can play, especially for the younger folks who need to grow up with positive values and far from crime in particular. And finally, the very reason Dragon Fafnir did attack the Kiltias, and Anastasis, the Grand Kiltias in particular, was treasure. Yeah, like Balthier. Fafnir was a dragon that wanted treasure that Kiltia had, which was in reality the relics from the Dynast King in the Still Shrine of Miriam. And because Anastasis is the one who sealed them there, Fafnir wanted to get access to them by beating the Grand Kiltias and destroying Boromyces. And the Pope, I think still today, has gold, has money, has lots of treasure. So that's another thing in common. Talking about medieval kings, and French kings in particular, there was Philip IV of France in the 14th century who entered a huge dispute with the Pope of his time, Boniface VIII, an Italian guy, because Philip, among other things, wanted to tax everything on his territory in France, including what belonged to the church, instead of sending the money to the Pope. And of course, the Pope wasn't happy about that. So what did King Philip do? He sent his chancellor, who in turn sent mercenaries, and one guy from Italy who hated the Pope. And those, believe me, weren't few. The mission was simple: depose the Pope, and do whatever it takes to appoint another Pope who would suit best King Philip's interests, which he eventually managed to do. And now there was a rumor about what happened in the Pope's palace that day, because the palace was attacked, the Pope's personnel left in terror, leaving him almost alone with his enemies. He got threatened by all those men in arms, and were he anything less than Pope, I'm not sure he would have been alive after that. Actually, he died about a year after this happened. And the rumor itself is about the attitude of the Italian that the King's Chancellor hired, because the rumor wants him to have simply slapped the Pope. Yes, and this rumor, along with many others in that time, during the reign of Philip IV of France and other kings of this time, were used and recounted by French author Maurice Gerun in his book saga called The Accursed Kings in the translated English version, which, among others, inspired G.R.R. Martin's A Song of Ice and Fire saga, as well as mine,
which, for reminders, talks about what happened before FF12.
Now back to FF12. What does this say about the Grand Kiltias? Remember what Judge Bergen did to him? Yeah, slightly a bit more than slapping him. Now, what was the job of the Italian leader who was violent with Pope Boniface VIII? Well, he was a Roman senator. Yes, hello Arcades. I have written in English, by the way, a page about the FF12 Arcadian Senate and the Roman Senate across all eras. So that is why we can say that there is at least slight resemblance between the figure of the Grand Kiltias Anastasis and Ivalice and treatment done to Catholic popes along the years. Because how did King Philip intend to depose the Pope of his time? Yes, that's right, by judgment. Exactly like Judge Bergen said. By deciding who should be dynast king and who shouldn't. So the Grand Kiltius is a very important figure in the world of Ivalice. He has a lot of power, and when that power becomes too irritating or an obstacle to the monarchs of his time, they do not hesitate to push him away, to kill him sometimes, in order to manipulate the state of the world with what they deem the truth. And that manipulation takes us to the second half of this talk, which is religion.
Religion, really?
As the Occuria in FF12. So, once again, what do we know about the Occuria? Pretty vague things, such as
we set the course and keep it true.
Or
Destroy Venat!
Sorry, I get carried away.
So, the Occuria define themselves with the quote, "Eternal, we are history's stewards to set the course and keep it true." Yes, but what true? What is the truth we are talking about? Well, it's their truth. Moreover, they add later, "We Occuria light the path for wayward sons of man." Oh God, that sounds like an insult, doesn't it? Just like, you bunch of headless bugs. So, the Occuria seem to set a big line between themselves and basically all of the other beings, and the humans in particular. They assume normal creatures cannot be guided by their own principles or morals, and therefore need them, divine beings, for basically everything the world is supposed to be. They consider themselves the light that God bestowed upon a world drowned into darkness. And by this alone, are already manipulating. Yes, they are supposedly gods. Not the gods of worship, like Pharam, etc., but the gods of creation. Sure, but hey, what did they create? Did they create the world? We don't have any proof of it. However, they did manipulate the world, so it goes towards the direction that suits them. Through, for example, the Dynast King Wraithwall, and currently, Princess Ash. However, everyone seems to agree that they did create the mass destruction weapon that is Nethicite. They also created the Sword of Kings and the Treaty Blade.
Both of which cannot hurt to talk about in the game.
And finally, they created the Espers, which are, what I know, another huge disappointment from the players. So, nice creations, right? Before withdrawing for their mission as superior beings, the Occuria used to live together with the other races. That's millennia before the game. And the Espers lived there as well. They were one big animated family. Except the Espers decided the party would not be complete without them being as powerful as the Occuria, as their creators. And that is precisely called a crime of lèse majesty, a crime of treason against the Occuria. So the Occuria got a little bit angry that all these Espers gathered around Ultima in order to gain this power and started a rebellion in the process. And they just sealed them and their power since they were not reliable anymore for action in the mortal world, which is literally the only use the Occuria can find in a being. So the Espers were sealed from the mortals' world, and the Occuria retreated to Girvagan. And so the Age of Chaos began in Ivalice. After this period, the Garif people began worshipping the Occuria, considering them as actual useful gods, which might lead us to think or wonder, were they friends when they were living together as one big family? Why are the Garif precisely worshipping and valuing the Occuria? We don't see any other being worshipping these gods, or wannabe gods, only the Garif. Whereas Pharam and the Kiltia deity have a lot of followers from diverse races and countries. Therefore, the Occuria are just like all gods. They only exist through what mortals choose to make of them. They can also be seen as the deus ex machina of FF12, the unexpected solution that comes out of nowhere to solve the plot. It is a process that was commonly used in the older forms of leisure that used to be theater rather than video games. And in this case, we have a game focused on what mortals, commoners, can do, such as Vaughn and then Balthier, Bosch and Princess Ash, before, in the second half of the game, focusing a lot more, if not exclusively, over those gods, both in means and purpose, meaning that with their tools, the Nethicite, as well as the Sword of Kings, etc., the plot is able to move on, but also the Occuria, led by Gerun, actually wants Ash to reconquer Dalmasca and be the queen. So it is also their wish that the party is fulfilling, willingly or not. And because Venat's wish is not this one, since Venat sided with the Empire rather than Dalmasca and Ash's party, well, basically Venat's wishes are the opposite of what Gerun wants. Then we kinda have two groups of Occuria in the game. One of them is the heretic Venat, as called by Gerun. It is the one Occuria that chose to stray from the path of the usual Occuria and actually give divine knowledge to mankind. And the other ones, the traditional Occuria, led by Gerun. Those still want to control everything and mankind to control nothing. In both groups, we have positive and negative aspects. For Gerun's side, the positive aspect is bringing remote kind of justice to the unfair invasion of Dalmasca by the Empire with weapons of mass destruction. So Gerun suggests that Ash uses similar or greater power to stop the Arcadians. But this is all based rather on Gerun's wishes of manipulation, of control of what's going on in Ivalice according to their interest, rather than the wishes of the ones concerned, of the country's rulers and people. On Venat's side, the negative is obviously that they were ready to lend, and actually did lend their knowledge to mankind, in order to create dreadful weapons, such as the Bahamut or manufactured Nethicite used for war purposes. But more directly, the source of all deifacted Nethicite's power, which is the Suncrest. Venat, remember, was the one who activated it, killing Gretus in the process. However, is that all about Venat's personality? Not really. We can see the end of the game, or the end boss, as a human who wanted to become an immortal legend, which is the Undying. Or we can see the same final boss as an immortal being, which is Venat, choosing to discard their immortal status to become mortal, to fuse with the human being, to feel his suffering and his despair, and, as they say, walk his path together. Venat's vessel's story and despair was the starting point of all that I've been writing since 18 years.
It can basically drive a car now.
It's how it all began, and what makes this story, Final Fantasy XII story, a non-Manichaean one. Nothing is actually black or white. If you look at the characters of Ash, of Balthier, of Larsa, etc., nothing is actually clear or one-sided from the beginning to the end. To conclude about the Occuria, they are mysterious beings who are designed to remain so, because what we've said about them so far does not unveil everything about them, or even a little bit, given the huge story that might be theirs, given their immortal selves. They don't even have a gender. And finally, something that I've noticed, if you count the Occuria as a race within Ivalice, then there are 12 races in FF12.
Hume, Moogle, Benga, Seek, Nimmo, Garif, Viera, Urutaniensa, Baknami, Rev, like Andora's assistant, Helga, like the Grand Kiltias, and Occuria.
Thanks for listening. Do not hesitate to tell me what religions in Ivalice made you think of regarding real or imaginary fictional religions. Was my insight useful?
That's what I wanted to hear. See you later.